Breaking chaos has erupted at the very heart of British politics. Keir Starmer, the man who promised order, control and stability, has just been humiliated in front of the nation. The Supreme Court has ruled against him, a staggering judgment that's being called one of the most devastating blows to a sitting Prime Minister in decades. Within minutes, Downing Street went silent. Advisers fled into back rooms. The press flooded the gates of Number 10. The man once hailed as Labour's iron reformer is now standing on political quicksand. And Britain is watching it unfold in real time. It began quietly. A bill passed in haste, signed in confidence. Starmer's Emergency Security and Integrity Act. A law meant, he said, to protect the nation from misinformation, online manipulation and foreign interference. But buried deep inside the legislation were powers so broad, so intrusive, that even senior judges warned it could turn Britain into something unrecognisable. It allowed government surveillance of digital communication, restrictions on protest, and the freezing of media accounts deemed destabilising to public order. Starmer called it protection. The court called it tyranny. This morning, at exactly 9:07 a.m, the Supreme Court issued its decision. Unanimous, unforgiving, unconstitutional. The law was struck down in its entirety, a legal annihilation that the press is already dubbing Starmer's Waterloo. The courtroom was silent when the judgment was read. Then came the words that shattered Downing Street's calm. This legislation represents an unlawful expansion of executive power, incompatible with the rule of law. Within seconds, phones buzzed. News alerts flashed across screens. And as the word spread through Westminster, everything Starmer had built began to crack. Outside the court, the crowd erupted. Protesters cheered, chanting, "Justice for Britain!" while Labour loyalists stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Reporters shouted questions, but Starmer's motorcade sped away without a word. Behind those tinted windows sat a man who'd just been stripped. Not of his office, but of his control. Because in politics, humiliation isn't just a word, it's blood in the water. By noon, the ripple had become a storm. Tory MPs demanded his resignation, calling the ruling a national embarrassment. Nigel Farage went live within minutes, declaring, "This is what happens when arrogance replaces accountability." Even senior Labour figures, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves, were caught off guard. Inside Parliament, whispers turned into panic. Leaks suggest that the Attorney General warned Starmer weeks ago that the act would not stand in court, but he pressed ahead, convinced he could outmaneuver both critics and judges. Today, that gamble detonated, and while the legal defeat was brutal, the political fallout was even worse. Markets shook. The pound fell nearly 2% in the first hour of trading. Civil servants reportedly entered containment mode, drafting emergency talking points for what they now fear could become a constitutional standoff. Because what happens when a Prime Minister defies the courts? What happens when the judiciary stands in open opposition to the government? The answer, for in British history, is simple. Crisis. The monarchy has remained silent so far, but palace sources describe deep concern. King Charles, who had privately expressed discomfort with Starmer's authoritarian streak, is said to be monitoring developments closely. One insider described the mood as sombre, cautious but decisive. If Starmer refuses to accept the ruling, royal intervention may not be far behind. For a nation built on centuries of constitutional balance, that's a scenario bordering on the unthinkable. A king forced to step in to uphold the rule of law against his own prime minister. Social media, meanwhile, is on fire. Hashtags like #StarmerResign and #Supreme Court Victory are trending across every platform. Journalists are calling this a turning point for British democracy. Ordinary citizens are tired of political manipulation and government overreach, are flooding comment sections, demanding accountability. For many, this is more than a political scandal, it's moral vindication, a moment when truth finally pushed back against power. And yet, behind the public celebration, something darker is stirring. Sources from within Downing Street claim Starmer is furious, defiant and unwilling to step back. One aide, speaking anonymously, said the Prime Minister slammed his desk and declared, "The courts don't run this country. I do." Those words, if true, may haunt him, because if the judiciary, the press and the palace align against him, Keir Starmer could soon find himself fighting not just for his agenda, but for his political survival. As evening approaches, Britain stands on edge. The opposition is sharpening its knives. The government is fracturing from within. Every corridor of power now hums with the same question: how long can he last? This is not just a legal defeat, it's a crisis of trust. Between the rulers and the ruled, between power and principle, the Supreme Court has spoken, but the Prime Minister hasn't. And until he does, one thing is certain: Britain is bracing for impact. By nightfall, the storm had swallowed Westminster whole. News helicopters hovered over Downing Street, the streets below flickering with protest banners and camera flashes. The nation's attention was fixed on one man, Keir Starmer, and what he would do next. The Supreme Court had drawn its line in the sand, but Starmer, cornered and burning with anger, was about to cross it. Inside number 10, aides whispered in corridors lined with history: Churchill, Thatcher, Blair. All had faced political battles, but none quite like this. Starmer wasn't simply fighting an opposition, he was fighting the system itself. According to leaked text messages obtained by several political journalists, Starmer's inner circle began drafting an emergency continuity directive, an order to temporarily delay the implementation of the Supreme Court's decision, citing national security risks. Legal experts called it madness, but for Starmer, it was survival. As the clock struck 9, he stepped into the Situation Room, surrounded by senior ministers. Witnesses describe a man visibly shaking with controlled rage. The Attorney General reportedly warned him again. The court's decision was binding. Starmer's reply was ice cold. Then we'll bind them back. It was a statement that sent shockwaves through the room, because in that moment, the Prime Minister of Britain was no longer defending law. He was defying it. Outside, the first cracks in his cabinet began to show. Rachel Reeves was the first to move. At 9:42 p.m, she released a cryptic post on social media: "The rule of law must always prevail." Minutes later, reports surfaced that Angela Rayner had quietly left Downing Street without comment. The once unified front of Labour leadership was fracturing in real time, and the cameras caught every step. Parliament was preparing for a rebellion, not from the opposition, but from within. Then came the leak, an internal memo titled Operation Iron Veil. It outlined emergency communication plans in the event of mass dissent following judicial interference. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was explosive. It confirmed what many had feared. Starmer's government had anticipated this confrontation. The memo described procedures to restrict live media coverage, enforce temporary internet pauses, and prepare rapid public reassurance statements to control the narrative. The revelation hit the airwaves like an explosion. By midnight, London was a city divided. On one side, furious citizens chanting for Starmer's resignation. On the other, riot police guarding Parliament Square. The atmosphere was electric, tense and unpredictable. Broadcasters cut between court steps, Downing Street and Buckingham Palace, where lights were still on long after midnight. Inside the palace, King Charles held an unscheduled consultation with his private secretary and the Lord Chancellor. Sources close to the palace described the king as deeply unsettled. For decades, he'd maintained a careful neutrality, but this was no ordinary crisis. One royal insider put it bluntly: the Prime Minister is challenging the very foundations of the Constitution. If he refuses the court, the Crown may have to act. The possibility of royal intervention, the king stepping into an active political dispute, was unthinkable in modern Britain. But whispers of Article 9 consultation began to surface, a rarely used constitutional mechanism allowing the monarch to advise Parliament in moments of national emergency. For the first time in living memory, the Crown was being forced into the centre of the political battlefield. Across the Atlantic, the news was spreading fast. The US president called for constitutional respect and democratic calm. European leaders issued polite but pointed statements about the independence of the judiciary, and yet in London, Starmer's tone hardened. During a closed meeting with select advisers, he reportedly said, "If I back down now, I'll lose the country." If I fight, I might lose my job. But I won't lose my dignity. The words were meant to sound noble. To many, they sounded delusional. The British public, however, was not divided by ideology anymore. It was divided by fear. Pensioners, teachers, business owners, people who had never protested a day in their lives were pouring into the streets, waving signs that read, "Hands off our democracy." In Manchester, Liverpool and Edinburgh, candlelight vigils turned into marches. The message was clear. The people had chosen the court's side. Back in Westminster, MPs were called into an emergency midnight session, an extraordinary move. Unseen since the days of war, the Speaker's chair stood tense as members shouted across the aisle. Conservative MPs demanded a vote of no confidence. Labour MPs pleaded for unity. The benches were chaos. The Prime Minister was absent. Secluded behind the iron gates of Number 10, watching the live broadcast in silence, every accusation echoed through those walls like thunder. And then, at 1:07 a.m, a single statement was released from Downing Street, just 17 words. The Prime Minister acknowledges the ruling and will respond to Parliament in due course. No apology, no acceptance. Just silence wrapped in defiance. The media called it a stall. Insiders called it a warning. By dawn, the headlines were unanimous. Britain in constitutional crisis. The nation had entered uncharted territory. For the first time in modern history, the balance between government, judiciary and monarchy hung by a thread. And that thread was now fraying. Keir Starmer's allies were deserting him. The courts had humiliated him. The people were turning against him. But somewhere inside Number 10, as the sun rose over a city in uproar, the Prime Minister wasn't done yet. Reports hinted at a secret meeting scheduled before sunrise, one final attempt to seize control before everything collapsed. The sun rose over Westminster with a strange, uneasy light, a dawn that didn't feel like morning, but aftermath. London was quiet, yet beneath the calm, a nation was trembling. The Supreme Court had spoken, the people had risen, and Parliament had cracked. But Keir Starmer was still holding the line. For now. At 5:30 a.m, a convoy of black cars slipped through the fog toward Buckingham Palace. Inside one of them was the Lord Chancellor, carrying an urgent letter, signed by 27 members of Parliament and endorsed by the Chief Justice himself. The message was clear. The King's intervention was now a constitutional necessity. In modern Britain, such a moment should never happen, and yet it was happening right now in real time. Palace insiders described the scene as historic, solemn and heavy with consequence. King Charles, dressed in a simple grey suit, read the document slowly, pausing several times. His silence said everything. For decades, the Crown had remained the silent guardian of the system, neutral, ceremonial, above politics. But when that system falters, the Crown becomes the last safety lock on democracy. This was one of those moments at precisely 6:45 a.m. The Palace issued a statement to all major networks. His Majesty has expressed deep concern over recent developments and has requested a formal audience with the Prime Minister. Those 23 words detonated across the airwaves. Reporters broke into live broadcasts mid-sentence. Hashtags erupted. Hashtag royal intervention. Hashtag Starmer summoned. Within minutes, crowds began gathering at both Buckingham Palace and Downing Street, chanting, waiting, watching history unfold. Starmer emerged from Number 10 just after 7. His face was pale, drawn, but determined. Cameras captured every step as he entered his car, flanked by security. No words, no smiles, only the low growl of engines as the convoy rolled toward the palace gates. For all the composure he tried to show, this was a man walking into a reckoning. Inside the palace, the meeting lasted just under 40 minutes, but those who were there say it felt like hours. The King, according to one senior aide, spoke firmly but without anger. He reminded the Prime Minister that no leader stands above the law and no government beyond the Constitution. Starmer listened, hands clasped, jaw tight. Witnesses later said the King's tone was fatherly but unyielding. The audience ended with an unmistakable line, "Your duty, Prime Minister, is not to your pride, but to your people." By the time Starmer returned to Downing Street, the tide had turned against him completely. In Parliament, whispers became declarations. Over 40 members of Parliament had signed a cross-party motion calling for an immediate vote of no confidence. The Speaker agreed. The session was set for 8 o'clock that evening, a political execution dressed as procedure. Throughout the day, Britain held its breath. The streets outside Westminster were flooded with demonstrators. Some cheering for democracy, others furious at the spectacle of collapse. The entire world was watching. Every major network carried the same footage, a government imploding under the weight of its own defiance. At 7:59 p.m, the chamber fell silent. Starmer entered, head high, papers in hand. He looked exhausted, but fierce. As he rose to speak, even his fiercest critics quieted. His words, though measured, carried the sharp edge of desperation. "I did what I believed was right for the safety of this nation," he said, "but if defending Britain's integrity makes me the villain, then so be it." The statement drew scattered applause, then angry murmurs. The vote began. Names echoed through the chamber, one by one. Each aye or no was another step toward his fate. The tension was suffocating. When the final count was read, 319 in favour, 292 against, the result struck like lightning. The government had fallen. Keir Starmer was finished. Gasps filled the hall. Some MPs cheered. Others stood frozen. The Speaker's gavel came down. It was over. Reporters outside shouted the news within seconds. Starmer loses confidence vote and Prime Minister to resign? The sentence that would define his legacy was already being written. At 9:17 p.m, Starmer stepped out of number 10 for the last time as Prime Minister. The night air was cold, but the crowd was burning. Some booed, some clapped, most just watched. Silent witnesses to the end of a reign built on control and shattered by the Constitution itself. Starmer paused on the steps, looked out across the streetlights and whispered to no one in particular, "History will remember what I tried to do." He turned, entered his car and was gone. Behind him, the doors of number 10 closed slowly. The sound heavy, final, almost funereal. The cameras stayed fixed on that black door. The symbol of power now emptied of purpose. Moments later, another statement from Buckingham Palace confirmed it. The King has accepted the resignation of the Prime Minister and will invite the leader of the opposition to form a new government. The nation exhaled. But it wasn't relief. It was exhaustion. Britain had survived a constitutional crisis, but not without scars. Across the country, people gathered in pubs, living rooms and town squares, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd just witnessed. The headlines were already rolling. Justice restored. Democracy defends itself. The fall of Starmer. Yet beneath the triumph, there lingered a question no one dared to ask out loud. But how close had Britain come to losing everything? Because this was more than a political story. It was a warning. Power, once unchallenged, always turns inward. And tonight, the system had fought back. The courts, the crown, the people. Each had played their part in pulling the country back from the brink. But for all the celebration, one truth remained. Britain had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. As the night deepened, the lights of Parliament flickered off one by one. The city went still again, like a nation holding its breath after a storm. Somewhere out there, Keir Starmer was just another man without office, without allies, and without a voice. Yet in the silence that followed his fall, one thing became certain. The story wasn't over. Because in British politics, power never disappears. It only waits for the next hand to take it. Night settled over London like a closing curtain. The city that had spent days roaring was suddenly quiet, as if exhausted from watching its own democracy fight for breath. But even in that silence, something deeper was stirring. The fall of Keir Starmer was not just the end of a Prime Minister, it was the beginning of a reckoning. In the echo of his downfall, Britain was left asking the questions it had ignored for far too long. How close had the country come to surrendering its freedom in the name of safety? How easily had fear been turned into obedience? And how many more leaders would cross that same line, convinced they were the saviours, when in truth they were the threat?